on Chof. Okay, we are in Chof Dalet Amud Beis. Chof Dalet Amud Beis at the two dots, about maybe a dozen or 15 lines from the top, and we're in the final turn. We're heading to the finish line on this sugya. Basically, we've been discussing the last few weeks whether or not, and based on Reb Shimon ben Elazar's comments, whether or not you find an object in an area that has Rov Kananim, meaning non-Jews versus Jews, whether or not there are different halachas as far as Shabbos Aveda, as far as returning objects. In other words, since a non-Jew, there's no mitzvah of Shabbos Aveda. So we're talking simply about the mitzvah, not about what is the right thing to do or not. That's a separate question. But as far as the mitzvah of Shabbos Aveda, there is no mitzvah for a Kanani. So if you find it in an area where there's Rov Kananim, then Reb Shimon ben Elazar would say you do not return. But it seems from what other things Reb Shimon ben Elazar said that may also be true in areas of Rov Yisrael. So we've been trying to go back and forth and from different cases identify whether or not you can extrapolate this halacha. Is it apply to Canaanim? Does it apply to Yisraelim? Does it apply to either or both? Neither or both. I mean, so we've been struggling with this now for a few weeks, and we're bringing rayas, and then we're slugging up the rayas. So we're still at that point, and hopefully today we may get some clarity. We'll see as we go forward what the position is on some of these cases. So there's two dots here. It says Ahu Gavra, right? Chof Daled Amud Beis. Ahu Gavra de Eshkach Arba Zuzah de Tzairei Besidna V'Shadi ben Biron. There's a person who found 4 zuzim. It's $4 or whatever the zuz was, wrapped up in a handkerchief, maybe, or wrapped up in some kind of a cloth, and he found them Binahar Biron, in the river Biron. So I was curious, is there such a river? Where is it? So I actually Googled it. And Biron is both a river and a town in France. So I took a look at the map, and not one name is familiar to me. So I mean, somewhere in the province, where not near Paris or not near anything. So at least extrapolated from that L'chaira, it's in a place that is primarily non-Jewish. That was my assumption, just based on what I saw on the map and from what they talk about. So obviously, there were Amoraim who were familiar with that area. Of course, Rashi is from France, but there were Amoraim who may have been familiar with that area. So they actually posited an example from that situation. So this river Biron, a person found in the river a cloth filled with arba zuzah. Also, the Kamei Rabbi Yehuda. So he came to Rabbi Yehuda. He said, "What am I supposed to do with this? I mean, I found it." So the chayra, his kasha that he came was, it was a havamina maybe that he had to return it. Amalei zil achris. He said, "Go announce it." Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda said you should go and announce it. So right away we're thinking maybe Rov Yisrael, there must be some reason why would he do this. But again, we don't have the facts yet. And again, we're trying to bring a raya. We're trying to find a definitive proof what to do and when to do it, whether it's Kanani or the. So that's the facts of that case. Frek the Gemara of Hazuto Shel Yambu. Why should he call it out? It's Zuta Shel Yam. Remember what we said. We said that among the examples of things that a person is meyayish, the person is just, he doesn't have any hope of return, is with regard to water, Zuta Shel Yam means the waves of the ocean that come back and forth. So if you're at the ocean and you drop something in the water and the waves go back and forth, if any of us have lost things in the water, as we probably have, you drop something, you start searching, and the tide goes back and forth, and before you know it, it's not there. Now, if you're lucky, maybe The tide will throw it back on later, high tide, low tide, and you may even find it. But mostly you're miyayish. My goodness, it's lost. The other example of water is when you have an overflowing of the banks of a river and it totally sweeps everything away. But certainly one of the two, Zuta Shalyama, or should apply here. So why is there a havamina? Why is there a havamina that there isn't yish here? Because why would he think if it's in the water, it's ever going to come back to him? That's the Gemara's kasha. Yeah, Jay.
Excuse me. So this event happens in France, and he has to go back to Eretz Yisrael to Rabbi Yehuda to ask the Shaila. And when he says you have to announce it, which country does he have to make the announcement?
No, so in all likelihood, I mean, I don't know where Rabbi Yehuda was at the time. If you're assuming that he was in Eretz Yisrael, then this story may have have happened, and it's a shaila that someone is asking you in Eretz Yisrael from a story that happened in Biran. I don't know. In other words, I can't answer you as to where it happened and where he's. But no. Clearly, the answer has to do not with Eretz Yisrael. If Rabbi Yehuda is there, it has to do with Biran. In other words, he is saying that this episode that happened in Biran, you have to announce in Biran. Not, of course, not in Eretz Yisrael. In Biran, you would have to announce it. Why? Because for whatever reason, we'll see in a minute. For whatever
Rabbi
reason.
Yehuda was doing some fundraising in Biran. He just happened to be there.
I just happened to be there, so they asked him the shaila. Okay, yeah, but no, but the story clearly is focused on Biran, not on Eretz Yisrael. In other words, the return would be in Biran. So v'hazut shel Yavnu, emfit the Gemara. So the chayra, what do you have a raya here? You have a raya that even prima facie, let's just put prima facie, Biran, it's probably a Kanani place, and yet we find that he has to return it. So the chayra, that's against Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, because Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar wants to say that if something is in a rabbim, you don't have to return it. Certainly not Kanani rabbim here. By from all intents and purposes, you have to return it. You have to return it. So l'chara, this is a raya against Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar's a principle of not having to return, especially in a Kanani location. Remember, we know nothing yet about Yisrael and Kanani. So our assumption is, where's Biran? It's in the middle of France somewhere. Who knows? Are they eating there? We have no clue. So l'chayra, it seems that this would be proof against Reb Shimon ben Elazar. That's what the Gemara is trying to say. Emphit the Gemara, no, can bring no proof at all. And this has been the pattern that we've had now for the last block, is that every time we think we have a breakthrough, we don't. Emphit the Gemara, Shani Nahar Biran, Kivon the Maskil, Lo Miyayish. Because it has impediments. Rashi, Maskil, Yeshbo Michsholim. It has impediments, Avonim. It has stones, the Stimas Getter, and gates, She'osun Ledagim, right? So in other words, this is a fishing area, so they have gates that they put down so that the fish, when they go upstream, are locked in. This is how they catch the fish. You know, they have this whole system of locks and gates. It's fascinating to see. I've seen it in the upper Pacific Northwest of this country, how they catch salmon and what they do. But basically, Stimas Getter means gates. She'osun Ledagim, below miyayish. And a person's not miyayish. Why? The river is not going to sweep away my four zuz beyond the mechsholim, meaning the rocks or the gates. And they typically scoured it, cleaned it, and collected all the debris. Sheesh betu meimov besomech, and he samech sheyimtze kishyiska also the income. So in other words, there's no yiush here. Why is there no yiush? Because why would there be yiush in his mind when clearly anything that fell into that river isn't going very far? It's going to go 10 yards, 20 yards, 50 yards, even 100 yards. But you're going to be able to pick everything out of the water because there's blockage. So the Gemara says over here, you can't bring a raya as to whether or not there is yiyush, because in this particular state, everybody knew that the Biron River was a river full of rocks and fish gates, so that no one was miyayish. So again, the Gemara is giving you, wants to pinpoint an example of why a person wouldn't be miyayish, even in the case of a river, where normally we say, forget about it. It's in the river, it's going downstream, you'll never see it again. So that's the Gemara's answer here. The Gemara's answer is no raya, shanabir and kibbin demaska lo miyayish. Freak the Gemara, now comes the kasha of Haruba Kanana Minu. But there's Rov Kananim, right? Our supposition was that Biran was not a Jewish city. So Rov Kananim, Shemami Ein Halacha Shem Ben Elazar, Afil Rov Kananim. So L'chaira, we bring a raya now against Rav Shimon ben Elazar, even in Kananim. You wanted to say that certainly by Kananim, but even we wanted to interpose and say that Rav Shimon ben Elazar's view of Yiyush applies even in Jewish neighborhoods, in Jewish areas where a person would give up, but certainly in a Kanani area. And from here you see that even in the Kanani area, there's the possibility of not having Yiyush. When you have these artificial barriers. Okay, we're not going to make a blanket statement, but certainly in the case where there's a Kanani community, and to say, my goodness, it's Canaanim, why should we even consider it? And again, but you'll ask, here's the kasha. The kasha is, let's assume that there was a Kanani neighborhood and that there were rocks and that there were fences. So it wouldn't go very far. And so you're telling me that that's a raya against Rav Shimon ben Elazar. But I would ask you a simple question. Well, wait a minute. A Shabbos Aveda against the Kanani, even when you know with certainty that you're going to find it, there's no Shabbos Aveda. In other words, inherently in the Gemara's kasha, you have to think about, what is the Gemara saying? The Gemara is saying this is a raya against Rav Shimon ben Elazar, even in the case where you have Kananim, where there is no mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda, we still say that you have to return it. That's an astounding thing, because since when does a Kanani have a mitzvah associated with it? Nevertheless, the Gemara wants to conclude that there's no riot for Shimon Elazar, ain't halacha for Shimon Elazar, afil b'rov Kanani. So the Gemara says no. I'm not going to go that far and say that in a case strictly of Canaan, no Jews whatsoever, and because you're going to be able to salvage the item, that you're going to say that there's no yish and you have to return it. That much I can't accept. This is the Gemara's answer now. No, so there's no raya against Rav Shimon ben Elazar. What does our case talk about? Shani na biran the Yisrael sachrele, the Yisrael karele. That there are Jews, in other words, there are Yidden who in that area have dammed the river, and they're the ones who sweep the river. In other words, there are Yisraelim there, and they were fishermen. So primarily the fishermen were the ones who were doing this. This is the terrace. Kibbin the Yisrael Sachrele. So since the Yidden are the ones who dammed it, Eimam Yisrael Nafal. Listen to this. So so who are the fellows who go into the water with the big boots and start putting up the dams and start putting up the gates? They're Yidden. And since they're the ones who populate the area, we're going to assume that the Metzia fell from their pocket, right? We're going to say that it fell from the pocket of the Yisrael. The Kibbutz Yisrael correlate, and since the Yidden are the ones who clean it out and is collected, lo miyayish. Then he won't be miyayish. Why? Because he's going to believe that if the Yid is the one who cleans it out, the Yid is going to return the item. So what we have here is yet another situation where we cannot reach a conclusion on, we've done this time and again, but the Gemara sort of postures positions to say that, you have to look at the circumstance of the case. In that particular case, it was only Canaan. Even if you want to say it was Eden, because Eden a fisherman and Eden do all of the stuff, you still can't come to a conclusion and say with definitively, because you know why you're going to return it. You know why you're going to say Hashavas Aveda is because Jews are the ones who worked the river, and therefore the odds are it was not from a Kanani that fell, and they're the ones who clean up. So there is a Yid will say, why should I be miyayish? My brethren are the one who are tending the water, and they're not going to take it for themselves. They're Yidden, and they're going to make and they're going to make Hashavas Haveda. At least they'll make an announcement. So I'm not going to be miyayish. So the Gemara's answer here is again no riot from Shimon Elazar, because the specific circumstances of the case don't lend itself to being able to conclude one way or the other, but particularly that it's a Kanani area, and therefore we don't have to return it. Therefore, when Rabbi Yehuda says machriz, he was saying machriz because he was well aware that in Biran, even though there may have been Rov Kananim, it was the Eden who were the fishermen. In other words, that fact may have been known to him. So if he knew the facts, and that's why you always have to, when you go to a Paisik, you have to understand the complete facts of the case. So he said, okay, Machriz. Why Machriz? It's Rov Kanani. Yeah, it's Rov Kanani in the city, but it's not Rov Kanani where it counts, in the river. So that's the Gemara's carrots. It's a very interesting, different scenario from what we've had before, but that's the Gemara's carrots. Take a look at Rashi. Sachrele Shekarin Nishnash Balaz, the way Osis Char Agnes Chari, and I don't know how that translates, but Sachro means he damned it, he put the dam in. So Amen me Yisrael Nafal, Rafika Chayiv Lahachviz, that's why the Buddha said, yeah, you have to announce it, because since the Jews were the ones who were the fishermen, it may have likely, at least a good likelihood, it fell from him. And we don't say that it was put there by somebody else. No, it fell out of his pocket. And since it's Israel, there would be a mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda. Lo miyayish shehukura yim soim, because the cleaners, the ones who go through the debris, who are Yidden, will be the one who will find it. And therefore, why should it be miyayish? Once a Jew is involved, they'll at least have some hope that a Yid will say, oh, wait a minute, this must have fallen from someone's a pocket of a Jew. I'm going to announce it. Therefore, he wouldn't be miyayish, even though it's a river. But since it's a river with a limited a stretch, we're not going to say that it's lost forever because it's downstream. Downstream, 50 yards. It's not once the boulders or the gates stop it, then there's no reason to be worried anymore. Okay, so that's the Gemara's at the end of that. Now we go to the next case. Still, the Gemara doesn't have a definitive answer. We're trying to get a definitive answer. Rabbi Yehuda have a shakel v'ozal basar to Shmuel. Shmuel was the Rebbe of Rabbi Yehuda, and as was the custom at the time, that the Talmud always walked a step behind the Rebbe. In other words, they didn't walk side by side, even if they were talking and learning. The Talmud, out of deference to the Rebbe, shakel basrei, he always was a step behind it. B'shuk at the Beidisa, he was in a what's the shuk the Beidisa? Says Rashi, Shemokun Sham Chitim. So think of Machne Yehuda, and this was the market for chitim, for wheat. In other words, in Machne Yehuda you have different sections, right? There's general sections, there's sections for fruit, there's sections for meats. I think if I remember, you can walk all over Machne Yehuda and find 10 meat vendors one next to the other, or 10 fruit vendors, because they're all selling their wares, so they pair them up next to each other so you can make your selections from like kind. So here he's walking through a market of chitim, of wheat, meaning grains. So again, you're talking about a very big market. And Rabbi Yehuda asked the following question: Amalei, Motzakan Arnike, Mahu. I'm walking through this market, and I find I find a wallet. Arnica. Arnica is is pretty much is like a wallet. So what do? Find a wallet. Amalei harelu shadal. So Shmuel said to him, "It's yours." Okay, fine, accept it. What about? So then he asked him again, "Boy Yisrael v'nosim bo simin mahu." What happens if a Jew comes up to him and gives him a simon for the wallet? In other words, he may not even announce it, because he said that it's yours, but somehow it got out that he found something, and the person said, "You know what? Take a look on the underside of the wallet. You'll see an X or a scratch or whatever it is." And he gave him a simon. So he said, then he said, "Omalei chayiv lahachzir." Then you're chayiv to return. Okay, so on the surface that seems okay, right? A wallet itself, no problem. He has some on him, you have to return. Freak the Gemara Tarte. How can you have both of these? They're in conflict. Why? What's pshat? Because remember what we said last week. We said last week that if you are in a state of yish, in other words, if you're going to accept that something is miyayish, then okay, then you no longer have to return it. You can't undo yish. If you accept the fact that a person lost a wallet, and the reason why you don't return it is because clearly it was such a busy place that it was miyayish, then it doesn't help later if he comes with a simon, because the yish already happened. You understand? In other words, a person, even if he says, if an individual says, I hold out a chance of finding it because I have a simon. So my simon will always be there and I'll always be able to find it. But we made a general rule. What was the general rule? The general rule is that a person who finds something in a public place, which we said this in the Gemara, Shimon Lazar, we actually quoted this Gemara, but this is the Gemara, the definitive Gemara. If a person finds something in a public place without, I mean, you're not going to get it back. He's miyayish. So that yish applies to everybody, even the one or two people who will hold out and say, I'm not miyayish. In other words, where there is a general sense of yish, your personal view doesn't matter. You can't say 99% of the people in the Yish, I'm not. That's not the way it works. If we say that there is Yish, it's because we're saying that the overwhelming population is going to be Miyayish, therefore you're included in that population. Now, it just happens to turn out that you, of all the people in the world, know there's a simon there. But if we're saying that you're going to be included in the group that's miyayish because it was found in Times Square, and nobody in their right mind thinks that anything ever will be returned in Times Square, even though you say, but wait a minute, I have my initials on it. Of course I'm going to get it back. No, it isn't. So the view is that you are part of the Rabbin, and therefore you're miyayish. So now he said, but what happens if someone came and bought a simon? Well, then you have to give it back. Yehuda to Shmuel, but why? The general rule already applied to everybody, even the people who have simonim. And we said that simon doesn't fly in the face of the rabbin. So that's his kasha. Tarte. You can't have both. You can't have both first to say that there's general yish, right? And then on top of that, you're going to say, no. You have to return it. Emphat the Gemara, Amalei, Lifnim Mishuras Hadin. So we touched on this, that this is Lifnim Mishuras Hadin. You're right. The rule is you don't return it. Why? Because the Rabbin and Miyayish, and you're part of the Rabbin. But Lifnim Mishuras Hadin, in other words, you go beyond the letter of the law. You're Ish Chosid. Then okay, fine. If you're an Ish Chosid, then even though 99% of the people won't return it, you will return it because it's L'Sim Mishur Siddim. What's an example? Kihod Abba Shmuel there was the father of Shmuel, Ashka Anach Chamre Midbara. He found these donkeys sort of wandering around in the desert. The Hadrina Lamare, the Bossa Tresa Yarche. And so they were lost for 12 months, right? For 12 months, these donkeys were missing, and he found them, and he returned them. Why? The Shnim B'Shur Sadin, because of the Indian Shnim B'Shur Sadin. In other words, the Shnim B'Shur Sadin is something that is extra outside the halacha, and it won't apply to you and me and everybody else, because we are of the category that we're part of the rabbi. But if you or I have what do you call that? An epiphany or a moment, and you say, wait a minute, I know I'm 100% right, but somehow something's tugging at me and saying, I don't think that this is right. If the guy actually can tell me that this is his donkey, or if the guy can actually tell me it's got a marking on it, even though I'm 100% not having to return it, we are, after all, we're Eden, right? So we say to ourselves, do I really want to hold on to this when I can be a tzaddik, I can be a good guy? You don't have to be a good guy, but if you are a good guy, it's lifting the Mishra. Yeah, Chaim. Yeah, I thought Chaim had a question.
No, I did. I was muted. I mean, it works for me as well to say you lose something in Times Square, right?
Right.
Because the rove would be miyayish.
Right, we have to go after Rove there. We have to go after Rove.
You lose something in Machane Yehuda. It doesn't matter that the rove would be miyayish. I mean, it doesn't matter what you're thinking. You have to go after the rove. That's correct. But if you lost something right near the fruit stand in Machane Yehuda, and before you could, I mean, someone finds a wallet. He sees that it has initials. He puts it in his pocket. And he is unlucky enough that he didn't move away from that area fast enough. And someone is running around screaming, trying to make eye contact with everybody. Did you see a wallet? Did you see a wallet? And this guy is unfortunate enough that the guy who lost the wallet made eye contact with him and said, the wallet had initials on it. Did anybody see it? Why shouldn't you have to return it? Why only with Mishoras Hadin? I mean, to me, it works. If you got away with it, you got away with it. And we assume that the owner was miyayish because that's what the rove would do. But once it happened to you that somebody did in your area, you heard him say, please, did anyone find the wallet? It had the initials JR on it. Did anyone find it? Well, you would have a chiyuv. It doesn't hurt anything that you have a chiyuv then to return it, because now you know. I mean,
well,
why are we going to stick with the fact, technically, you're free and clear because most people in the city would be miyayish. I don't understand why that would still work.
Okay, so your point is very well taken. So I think what we have to understand, the terminology we're using is that you're going to paint with a broad brush.
Slippery, yeah.
Right. In other words, you can't start making the halacha for you and for you and for you. So we're making a halacha, but we're saying within the halacha there is such a thing as lefnim b'shur sadin. So pamaya shenmala.
But that's wrong. That's wrong.
So the real question is, here we are a few days after Yom Kippur. What is the Rebbeinu Shalom going to look at and say, Chaim, you did right or you did wrong? I can't fault you for not returning because there has to be a halacha for everybody. Otherwise, it would be chaos. But lefnim b'shur sadin, wait a minute, don't take lefnim b'shur sadin lightly. Oh, it's only for extreme. Lefnim b'shur sadin means all of us should be lefnim b'shur sadin. We're all Yidden. We all should have that moral compass that if something doesn't seem right, or you have the ability of righting the ship, even though you're not necessarily required to, that will do it. Which means we hope that lefnim b'shur sadin for all of us is the way to go.
But what you're saying
your
is,
point, you can't start making a general rule and then saying, but in a particular
Okay.
case where the guy runs around, that general rule has to be suspended. That would be chaotic.
I see.
Rabbi, if I could jump in, I was gonna say, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was gonna say, I see it as a slippery slope. In other words, if you start looking at each degradation of the cases as more and more likely to do it, then you're right. Then it falls into chaos. So you have to have a hard and fast rule,
Right.
but people hopefully will kind of go above that rule. And so in Chaim's case, if somebody's running around screaming, hey, I lost a wallet, JR, even though I think JR was shot, but anyway, looking for JR's wallet, then hopefully the person will go Lifnei Mishor Asadin and give it back. But the hard and fast rule is he could walk off and keep it.
But he's not a good guy. He's not a good guy if you walk
Right.
forward. Right. And Chaim, we can't force him to do it, but in the scheme of things, people will say, not a good guy, not a good guy.
Right, but if you were to say with a broad stroke, most people would be miyayish, but if you happen to hear someone give a specific symbol that you now are aware of, you do have to return it. That's too slippery a slope. You're then degrading the general rule. Is that what we're saying?
Right, and that's what the term Lifnei Mishor Asadin was used.
Okay.
But it's not to say, oh, in the extreme case. Lifnei Mishor Asadin shouldn't be an extreme case. It should be a caveat to the general rule.
Okay, but the general rule still has to stand and firm.
Listen, I'm with you. I'm walking in Machane Yehuda, and all of a sudden I put my hand on my hip, and I realize my wallet's missing. Wait a minute, I'm in Machane Yehuda. Yes, there are hundreds of people. Yes, there are Yidden and Arabs and Goyim and Turks and who knows what. But I'm in Machane Yehuda. If I make an announcement and I say, Chevra, please check. Look, the floor, look at a stand. I may have left the wallet. I still have a Havamina. I would have a Havamina that some righteous soul, this isn't Times Square, it's Machane Yehuda, let's just say. I would have the Havamina. I may be way out of line, but I would have the Havamina.
You may give up in 2 or 3 minutes or in 5 minutes, but at the moment you might still have the Havamina.
I still might have the Havamina, right? And say, wait a minute, I just realized it. I may have left it at the last vendor, or it may have fallen out when
But you're still saying within the precise 4 corners of the law, you
Right.
can't add that. You can't tack it on to the general law.
Exactly what we're
All
saying.
right, okay.
Exactly.
Rabbi, I want to support Chaim's case. You're still in the area within a very short period of time. The case we just had before was they said it's yours, but if somebody comes to you, chazarti, return it. So you have a simon, it's right there. It's in the time, let's say it's within 10 minutes of it happening. Why isn't the law extended to say if somebody can identify it on its own in that time, that's the law too, that you have to return it then, but otherwise you're able to keep it?
Because Michael, I think that now you're starting to talk about arbitrary limits.
No, it's in that time, in that place.
But what's reasonable and what is within the time and place, within 5 minutes, 3
Right.
minutes, 10?
Right.
minutes?
What if it's 12 minutes? What if it's 15 minutes? What if it's a
Right.
larger area?
Now we're having a debate about what's reasonable.
Can I
Go
say
ahead.
something? Yeah. So I think actually, Lisa, I was thinking this before, but these last couple of people mentioned about the timing, and that I think is the key. When we have a halacha, how far, if to wash for bread, if you have to travel a certain amount of time, you have to go back or forward or whatever, or wait to go ahead and wash. But if it's a
Right.
certain amount of time before you get to water, you can eat without washing. That's where you have total control over it. So time does matter in halacha, and we have, it's not just physical things like how long till matzah becomes chametz. But in this case, the problem is there's no timestamp. When a wallet drops on the floor, there's no timestamp that pops onto it that says it dropped at 10:42 a.m. Because if we had such a thing, then it would be very easy. We would say you've got 18 minutes, and if nobody finds it, therefore by 11 o'clock, it's yours. And if it's less, then you have to yell out in the plate, whatever. But you don't know. It could be it dropped 2 minutes ago, like this case here. The guy comes running back.
You didn't realize it. Yes.
It could be it was dropped yesterday, and got knocked under a table, and today somebody else was walking around and got knocked back out. You, as a person who found it, have absolutely no way to know. And therefore, we have to have a hard and fast rule, can't be dependent on the time.
Right. I think that's a good point. In other words, once you start making these little limitations and saying it's good if it's 10 minutes, but if it's more than 10 minutes, not. And Michael, to your point, I understand that everybody should somehow have that little grace period. But the problem is when you're making a rule for the cloud, you can't look at specific cases. So the rule for the cloud is that if you're in a Rishus Harabim, you're in a place where people go and you lose something, even if it's 90%, 95% of people are miyayish. There's always those people who won't be miyayish, but 90% of the people will be miyayish for all the reasons we just said, because it happened yesterday, or because no one here is going to return my wallet with money. I don't believe in Good Samaritan. I mean, you can think of everything under the sun, but of course, there's always the exception because there's always someone who might find it and someone who might return it. But you don't want to make the rule based on the exception. So that is the problem. So we have a general rule. The general rule is Yiyush. And then in order to counter the general rule, we use the term Lifnim Mishuris Hadin. In other words, don't look at it as being something that is sort of unique. Lifnim Mishuris Hadin means you have a moral compass. And if your moral compass says, hey, there is a simon here, I should really go and try to find somebody. They may have certainly been miyayish, and I have every right to take it and never look back. But because I have a moral compass, i.e. Lifnim Mishuris Hadin, I'm going to try to find it. And maybe, just maybe, I'll feel great that I found something, I could return something special, something of tremendous value, where a person would be forlorn. I remember a situation where my wife found a magnificent diamond brooch at a wedding. Now, okay, your wedding, you could say, it was a wedding probably with hundreds and hundreds of people, but it was finite. Okay, there wasn't just a Robin with 1,000 people. So what did she do? Of course, she went to the I don't know, to the hosts or wherever, and they made an announcement, and it all was returned. Now, can you imagine if that was a Rishus Harabim and someone found a diamond brooch worth $10,000, $20,000, who knows how much? Would they have a Havamina? Most people would say, wait a minute, it's insured, they lost it, they don't think they're going to get it back. What am I doing here? But again, we're saying that we are a people of conscience, and therefore, the Lifnim Mishuris Hadin tells us that we should try. We may not be successful in returning it, and then in which case there are halachas, but we should try. So when you have that stira, so then Shmuel says, you know what? The halacha, Rav Yehuda says, you don't have to return it, but if you find with a siman, then it's not a stira to say Lifnim Mishuris Hadin, because the halacha still is you don't have to return it. You don't have to return it, but if you choose to, because of Lifnim Mishuris Hadin, you're a little bit more of a chassid, then you'll do it. Okay.
Rabbi, why aren't we consistent? We have a general principle that we learned earlier about Amos Mechavera Olav Araya.
Right.
General presumption is the person who's in possession has it, but owns it, but it's subject to Araya. So why isn't the person coming along and giving us a simon, a convincing simon, the same thing as a raya?
You would be 100% correct, but we have this little thing called Yiyush. In other words, if we've established Yiyush as the underlying theory in the case, Hamotzi Mechavera Olav Haraya doesn't work anymore. Hamotzi Mechavera Olav Haraya is in a situation where, look, the odds are it's a totally even playing field. I lost something, and I'm going to go look for it. And if I find it, I'll bring a raya, and it'll be mine. And that's fine. That is the halacha. But Hamotzi Mechavera is up against a theory of Yiyush. That theory of Yiyush already undercut the Motzi Mechavera, because the Yiyush said, nobody nobody, i.e. 98%, okay, nobody believes they're gonna get it back. Once you establish that, forget about Motzi Mechavero. Motzi Mechavero never happens because Yish is the controlling characteristic. So if we say Yish is the controlling characteristic, now we're back to Flim Shur Sadin. Again, the guy isn't going to willingly give it up. He'll give it up because the guy has a simon. Now, so he comes back with a simon, and he says, "Okay, I'm a good guy. I believe that even though I'm totally in the right in keeping it, I will not keep it because I believe in the Flim Shur Sadin. I believe in being a righteous person. But the Hamotzi Machavero no longer has teeth." Because it was basically the teeth were knocked out when you said Yish. That's what you have to
Rabbi,
do.
the Yish is subjective. You're saying you're going to poll and 99 out of
No,
100.
it's not subjective. That's exactly the point. The point he's saying is if the general rule that Rav Shimon ben Elazar said in a Rishus Harabim, in a place where people are even a super Rishus Harabim, there's no such thing as you're going to find it. In other words, it's so absolute, even though you, Michael, might say, but there's still 1% of the people. We're making laws not for the Yachid, but for the Rabbin. So if we're going to say, as a matter of course, we've got to cut it off. We've got to say that this is defined as a Rishus Harabim. Rishus Harabim, there is something called Yish. You may not be Miyayish, I may not be Miyayish, but Rove people are Miyayish, so we're going to apply the theory to that case. So now, and that's not subjective, that's now an objective view. I know it's hard sometimes to think of it that way, but in order to make halacha, you've got to at least come together and create some general rules. Now, there are exceptions to rules, of course, we know that, but you've got to at least establish the general rule. Otherwise, like we said before, it's a slippery slope. There's no way that you're going to keep any kind of correct pattern if you're going to say what applies to you doesn't apply to me. It applies to Yenim, it doesn't apply to Yenim. You can't live that way. So you have to have a general rule. Yeah, go ahead.
The Rishus Harabim is gauged by how many people pass through there. But within a
Right.
Rishus Harabim, there may be an isolated corner. You may have
Right.
left it there, for a second and forgot about it and left. But it's a Rishus Harabim. So by virtue of the fact that you left and it's declared a Rishus Harabim, by definition, you don't have a right to get it back. That just seems wrong for who we are.
Well, just to remind us, we've had situations in the Gemara where it was a Rishus Harabim, and then within the Rishus Harabim, there was a little side street in the Rishus Harabim, to your point, and someone, there was found a Metzia there. Then you can question, is that really in the Rishus Harabim? Because it's part of the Rishus Harabim, but it was a separate area within the Rishus Harabim. So I understand the frustration in making general rules, because general rules somehow aren't fair to the particular situation where it doesn't fit the general rule. In other words, it doesn't exactly fit the general rule. Why should I be bound by it? And that's a fair question. But to establish, for instance, if this discussion took place in a Carmelis, right, or took place in a Makkah Patur, or took place in anything but a Rishus Harabim, we'd be having a different discussion. But because a Rishus Harabim, whether it's 100 people, 1,000 people, 500,000 people, whatever you define, whenever there is a Rishus Harabim, it's like one size fits all. It's a Rishus Harabim. Now, again, fortunately, as part of the halacha, the Flim Shur Sadin was built into the halacha not to be a total b'diavad, not to be oh yeah, if I'm a nice guy. The Flim Shur Sadin is something that all of us in our daily lives should be part of who we are. In other words, we're not saying, at least the point is that we should not be saying, like you say, it's not fair. Why is it? You're right, it's not fair. That's why the Flim Shur Sadin was created, so that maybe 80%, not 100, maybe 80% of the people who would otherwise be advised don't return it would return it. that's a pretty overwhelming odd if you're going to tell me that many people would return it because of Flynn Mashur Sadin. So I think you have to be a little bit circumspect here and think about this. There has to be a rule. Without a rule, it's hefker. So we created a rule. But once we created the rule, we also created the tableau. We created the antidote to the rule, and we're saying, but wait a minute. Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. If the rule says you don't have to return it, but it's staring you in the face that everything says you should return it, then you really should be a tzaddik and return it.
Hatov Hayosher is a derisa.
Hatov Hayosher, right? Exactly. But you can't say with total abandon that the person is a Russia if he doesn't return it. He's not a nice guy. He certainly, if the shoe were on the other foot, would want someone to help him. But al pi halacha, he is. There's an expression that I guess something like rue the day when we follow the law. So, something along the lines that if you follow the law, you can become a tzaddik impels. In other words, if you follow the strict construction of the law, yes, you're a good guy, but you're a tzaddik impels. What are you doing? I mean, you're only helping yourself, and that's not the way we should be looking at it. But at least the Gemara has to give us that understanding that there is a general rule, and then there are specifics, and those specifics we hope and we imagine that many people will follow, but we can't say with certainty that they would. Okay, let's just go to the next situation. Rava Hayashakal Ozl Basav Rav Nachman. Another case where Rava followed a couple steps behind his Rebbe Rav Nachman. Beshuka the Geldoi, also in a public marketplace. This is exact story. What is Geldoi? Ritzanim. That's like a leather market. In other words, they were walking in a market where leather was selling. And some say that it was a shuk where many rabbis walked back and forth. In other words, it was a Jewish market. Amalei. So Rabbi asked Rav Nachman, Matzakan Arnaki Mahi, if I find a wallet here, what should I do? Amalei Harelu Shalom. Then he asked him, Boy Yisrael V'Nosam Simin Mahu. What happens if a Yid gave a simin afterwards? Amalei Hari Elu Shalom. It's his. Now, wait a minute. Chaim. V'halo Omed V'Tzavach. But he's standing there screaming, I lost the wallet.
Right, this is my
I lost
case.
the wallet. There you go. Right there,
My
the Gemara
case.
says, I lost the wallet. You're screaming at the top of your lungs in the middle of the shuk, and you have rabbis walking back and forth, and everybody's listening to this.
Right.
How can Rav Nachman say Hari Elu Shalom, right? It's astounding. Okay, so now we're going to get a definitive answer, right? V'halo omer v'sevach nasik et sevach al beso shenachal v'al tfinoso shetavas b'yam. The Titanic sunk. The Titanic sunk. Your possessions were on the Titanic. I'm screaming, I lost my wallet. Where are you going to get it? At the bottom of the sea. A building collapsed, Rahman al-Islam.
Right.
It's totally destroyed. It's totally destroyed. There's not a shred. I mean, a 9/11, Chas v'sholom. In other words, you're talking about something that there is no remnant.
So we're
You
comparing
scream-
this to that. We're
Scream
comparing.
all day long. Scream all day long. I lost it. I lost it. I lost it. So again,
Okay,
it seems a little bit out of line, but what Rav Nachman is saying
right.
is saying the screaming is what's going to bring it back. Is the fact that it's lost. The fact that it's lost because it's as if it was sunk to the bottom of the ocean. And that's a stark contrast for us to understand. You drop something in the water and you see it slowly making its way down, and you're totally forlorn. But I lost it. I'm screaming, help me, I lost it. Teretz says, again, there's something that's finite. Again, there's the Fnei Mishur Sadin.
Saying my principle stands firm. That's actually the point he's making. Do
Right.
not try and dissuade me and give me cases. My principle stands firm. It's as though it sank with the Titanic.
Right. Again, so maybe this gives us a little bit of a sharp contrast and understands that how definitive it is that you can no longer, okay, let's go one more. Hahu dio, Dishakal, Basar, Bashuk, a very interesting case where you had a dio is defined as Of Shakarin, Uzlatur, Buhulashan dio. So it's commonly referred to as a bird of prey, or, you had a bird of prey, the Shakal Basar, Bashuka, that swooped down and picked up a piece of meat from the marketplace. V'share b'tzanaisa debay bar Miriam, and it dropped it. In other words, it swooped down, flew another 100 yards, and then there was a cluster of trees, of palm trees that belonged to Bar Miriam, and dropped the meat in Bar Miriam's ground. Also, the Kamadi Abaya. So they came, right? So this is, in other words, a specific case. They came to Abaya, Amalei Zil Shakal and Nafsha. He said to Bar Miriam, keep it for yourself. It's yours. Frank the Gemara of Haruva de Yisrael Ninu. You're talking about a shuk of Jewish butchers, right? So they're all eating there. And this animal came, this bird came and swooped up the meat. So you know it came from the Yid. And yet you're telling me you don't have to return it. So l'chayra, it's a riot or Shimon ben Eliezer that what? That Rov Yisrael you don't have to return.
Right.
Shema mino halachas Reb Shimon ben Eliezer afilu b'Rov Yisrael. So l'chayra, this is now definitive. Again, we're still grasping for an understanding of Reb Shimon ben Eliezer's halacha. So l'chayra, this is a good halacha.
Right.
That even in a place of Rov Yisrael, the meat was dropped, and therefore we see that by Rov Yisrael you don't have to return it. Emphit the Gemara, no. Shana de yo zuto kishel yam dami. So he says you can't bring a raya because when a bird of prey swoops in like this, it's considered like zuta shel yam, and a person is right away is miyayish. In other words, when you see like a bird coming out of the sky and ripping something off and flying off,
You're never going to see it again.
you're never going to see it again. So immediately you have this sinking feeling of yish. Therefore, the Gemara, he wants to show that there's enough of a reason not to follow the halacha. Right? The Gemara of Omarav, Basar, Chanel, Mina Ayin, Osir. But wait a minute. Why do you even have to come to that? We have an interesting halacha. The halacha says that, especially with meat, there has to be a chain of possession. In other words, kosher meat, if it falls out of the chain of possession, you can never rely on the fact that it's still kosher meat. So the chayra, this animal, this bird, swooped up. Yes, he swooped it up from a kosher butcher, but then he was out of sight. And the next thing you see, he's dropping a piece of meat in Bar Miriam's backyard. How do you know that in that 30 seconds or minute or two, he didn't pick up another piece he dropped that meat, picked up a piece of nevela from a goy and dropped it in Bar Miriam. So Bar Miriam can't know for sure that it should belong to him, that it's kosher, because maybe it is a thing. So just 1 second, Menashe. So another, what kind of raya are you going to say that it has to do with is kazuta shel yam? Has nothing to do with zuta shel yam. It's basa hanela min ayin. And for the Gemara, ba'omid v'ra'o, no. We're talking about a case where you track the bird. You saw the bird pick up the meat. You saw him fly in the air. He wasn't going anywhere. He went 100 yards and dropped it in Bar Miriam. So you saw the whole thing unfold, and there's no havamina of anything. So it basically just wanted to discount the fact that it could be basa and element ayin. But you still don't have a raya from here because we're saying that it's kazuta shel yam. In other words, you have no raya to say, oh, wait a minute. If it's Rov Yisrael, you still don't have to return it. Really, you have to return it. But when you have a bird of prey that comes in, you're sunk. You have no havamina, you're ever going to get it back. And therefore, that's the reason why you don't have to return it. It has nothing to do with Rov of Eden. Yeah, Menashe.
Yeah, so actually on this very last point, there's another answer. Saying that it's not that you didn't see the meat because you saw the entire process, but even if you didn't, if you found it, it's still not worthless. Maybe it's worth less, but it's not zero value because lakel tashlutin you find this random piece of meat, you have a dog, at least you don't have to buy dog food that day.
Right, right. So you can feed them, the dog, right? Okay, but we're talking in the larger picture. In other words, is there, so he's saying that there's right away yield. A person never expects that he'll get it back. So let's take a look at Rashi. Dio, Of, Shikar, and also Rulashan Dio. The Shade, Bitsnaisa, the Bay Barbarian, Shlifusu Bang the Kolim between the trees of Barbarian, also Shema, Nechloth, and Avela. So we're saying that Basa Hanelam and Ayin is also because of because maybe he exchanged it for non-kosher meat. It says Varoeh Mishanatlo Achehishliko. From the time the bird took it until it dropped it, he saw everything. Therefore, you can't give that answer. But again, we're left here still with a quandary of what Shimon ben Elazar is talking about, and so we still have a little bit to go. So we still don't have an answer. Again, the Gemara poses these. Each of these examples is just, it tells us a lot about halacha, because we had this whole discussion this morning, a terrific discussion about what's right about making a halacha a general rule, and you're right. I mean, but that's the whole point of the Fnim Meshuras Adin. Don't look at it as an extraordinary remedy. The Fnim Meshuras Adin should be the norm. You can't force him to do it. Now, maybe a community, if a person doesn't fit into, there are communities, by the way, which we know who they are, where they take extreme views, and if you don't follow the extreme view, you're ostracized. So in other words, there should be the normal position, and you take an extreme view, it's Tavalaf Bracha. But that community says, no, Tavalaf Bracha. That's you gotta follow the extreme view. If you don't follow the extreme view, you're not part of the community. So in other words, the Fnim Meshuras Adin then becomes the halacha as opposed to the extraordinary remedy. And there are communities where that's the case. But we again, I think what the Gemara is really teaching us is what we said in general. We're sitting around a Gemara. We all have this feeling of it's not right. We should do Hatay v'Hayasher, as David says, and we all would do Hatay v'Hayasher. But you got a big, wide swath of people who don't know from Hatay v'Hayasher, and you can't necessarily say that we can impose ourselves on them because they don't want to do the right thing. To me, the right thing is, if it's Hefker, it's mine. And unfortunately, that's the rove of the people, and we are the minority. Yeah.
It's Yale. Just if you have just a minute, I want to share with you I think a very nice true story about Lifnei Meshuras Adin. There was a gentleman who lived up Fulham. His first name was Lou, and I can't remember his last name. He passed away a couple of years ago. Very
Joseph.
Badly bent over.
Lou Joseph.
Was it?
Oh,
Lou Joseph. Thank you.
Lou Joseph.
Always attended the Rabbi Shurim. Always had a walker. So one of my boys' bar mitzvahs, we had a nice party in the park like we usually do, and it turns out my mother lost a fairly valuable bracelet. She didn't realize it until she got back to shul. So she never mentioned it to me, and she had sent some people back to the park. They went up and down the park. They couldn't find it. She just, basically gave up. So Lou Joseph, he's walking home, and he doesn't know anything about the lost bracelet. He sees this very nice bracelet on Lamberton, I think between North Belgrade and Fulham or something like that. He picks it up. He catches me after Shabbos to say, I know you had a simcha in shul. Maybe one of your guests might have lost this. And he gives it to me. I don't know anything about it. So I start asking around, and I finally got to my mother. She says, oh, that's my bracelet. I totally gave up hope. So I just thought of that. He found this very nice bracelet, no connection to anything, no reason to think that it might belong to anybody related to my family, but he knew I had a simcha that day. So maybe somebody in my group might have lost it on their way walking up and down Lamberton. I just, I thought of that as we were talking about the Lifnei Meshuras Adin.
So that's a beautiful example of the Lifnei Meshuras Adin. The only thing about that case that doesn't fit into ours is that that maybe your mother didn't lose it if it was Reshus HaRabim. In other words, losing it either in the park or
in Lamberton.
Or in Lamberton or Fulham doesn't necessarily qualify as a Reshus HaRabim. So therefore, maybe you can't impute real Yush. But the example is a perfect one of showing that from the other side of it, that let's say had been a Rishus Harabim, and he innocently said, you know what, let's say it wasn't a big public park and he knew you had a simcha, and he could have, could have said, listen, it could be anybody, right? It's Rov
Right.
Yisrael, but it could be anybody. And maybe Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says that Rov Yisrael, I don't have to, again, assuming this was going through his mind. But yeah, it's a wonderful story. And Lou was really a very special person. He's,
Yeah.
I'm sure I gave as well, and always thirsting for knowledge.
He
and
was said to
information.
have attended every shear, and he was the one that brought Rabbi Kranz into our shul to give the hesped.
Oh, wow.
I mean, that was
Wow.
Rabbi
Yeah.
Rosenbaum introduced him, and he gave the hesped. So people were saying, unfortunately, that's what it took. But that's the kind of person. That's the respect.
No, he was very special, but you're right. Lifnim B'Shur Sadin, that's a wonderful example of Lifnim B'Shur Sadin. But again, I think from our standpoint, especially during Yom Noraim, but even not, we should hold ourselves to a higher standard, but realizing that there are others who won't, and al pi halacha, you can't impute to everybody that higher standard. I know it's frustrating, Michael. You're very frustrated with that. I am too. But at the end of the day, I think we have to realize that the halacha was meant for the rabbin, and we are a yachid. I mean, we're yechidim. We're even though all from people are yechidim, we would do the right thing. But since the Rove people probably might just simply say it's lost, I found it, end of story. But again, the contrast is there, and that's what the Gemara is trying to show us: is that there is a remedy, although it's a remedy that may be limited only to those chassidim who hold from the Lifnim B'Shur Sadin. All right, so Mitzvah Shem, we have one more week of this. I thought we'd finish today, but we have one small section left before we get to the next Mishnah, and maybe we're going to get an answer to the mystery of what Reb Shimon ben Elazar holds. Yeah, Chaim.
I'm just, yep, thank
Yep.
you.
Okay, so Mitzvah Shem next Sunday, Cholamoid, we're gonna resume, and we look for everyone should have a Freilich and Yontif, Simchus Yontif, Sukkis, and hopefully the weather holds. We'll be able to make our brachas, lulav and esrog and all. Don't forget to get your lulav and esrog if you ordered it today. I think it's due right now. So Mitzvah Shem, we'll see each other next week.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Well, good yontif, everybody.
Good Yontif to everyone.
When are they giving them out in shul? When is it tonight?
Now, 10 o'clock.
Ah,
And
thank you.
10 till 8.
Thank you.